Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of The Chocolate Life Live. My name is Clay Gordon. I'm your host and your moderator, and I'm also the creator of and moderator and chief writer at TheChocolateLife.com. I want to welcome everyone today and start out by asking everyone, go into the comments or into the live chat, wherever you might be watching, whether it's YouTube, LinkedIn, or Facebook, and let me know where in the world you are connecting from. Well, I get to see if you're connecting from LinkedIn, YouTube, or Facebook, so you don't need to say that. But if you're connecting from somewhere in the United States or connecting from someplace internationally, let me know. I will get your shout out up on the screen. And you can also use the comment section or the live chat replay to ask questions or make comments about anything that you hear during the course of the live stream. I will get that up on the screen and respond to it. So read your comments and answer your questions. So at any point during the course of the hour, please go and do that. I also want to remind everybody that the sponsors of today's live stream, The Chocolate Life Live, are the members of TheChocolateLife.com. If you're not a member, you can go there and help support the work I do. And if you're watching on YouTube, please go like, subscribe, share, comment. All of these things will help spread the work that we're doing here. And with that, what I want to do is I want to jump into the heart of what we're doing. I want to start off, just preface this by saying that this is the homepage of The Chocolate Life. If you go there, what you can do is you can catch up, obviously, on all the previous posts that have been written, as well as live streams that have been broadcast, streamed. But also there is an individual post for every single one of these live streams. And so before each episode, you can go in, you can get an episode overview, which is here. You get an idea of what it is that we're talking about. And there's also a set of links to resources. Also, if you're a Chocolate Life member, and what I want to do is I want to thank Mark at Blue Spruce Chocolates for doing this. He made a comment on some of the reading material that I posted, and there's a question and comment in there that I will get to over the course of the hour. So, Mark, thank you very much for doing that. It's a very, very interesting question that you ask. And with that, we're asking the question, will there be cocoa here? And one of the questions is, why this topic? And that is because the day before yesterday, or yesterday, actually, I take that back, this showed up on LinkedIn. And this is a post from the Corporate Accountability Lab. It's a Chicago-based organization. And they're talking about a brand new report that they published. And they published this report. It's dated the 29th of September, but I believe that this was one of the first announcements of it, in which the title of it is, "Will There Be No More Cocoa Here?" with the subtitle, "How Companies Are Extracting West African Cocoa Sector to Death." Right? And I thought about this in the context of other things that I've done. So last week I did a live stream on the high cost of cocoa, and these are obviously related issues. And I thought it made sense given what it is that I had done last week. And, I was intrigued by the way it was presented on LinkedIn, the number of people who had liked or comment or otherwise responded to it. And I'm very, very interested on the fact that there's not been a whole lot of engagement on this. Very few comments, although there have been some reposts about it, as you can see here. But in light on engagement. And so I thought, it's going to be fairly interesting. I thought fairly interesting, the topic for me, to do a moderately deep dive. There's only so much that can be done in the course of 24 hours on this, but I have read much of it and thought about it quite a lot since learning about this particular report. And so one of the things that you will find when you go to the links section, so there's a link to the previous live stream. There are some other online resources, including a direct link to the Corporate Accountability Lab website and related studies that I want to point your attention to, as well as some other resources that are available online, particularly some reports from an organization called the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And I just wanted to put those here. I thought about actually embedding the report from Corporate Accountability Lab into the page, but there is a copyright license notice, and I believe that what it is that I'm doing falls within fair use, but I don't necessarily know that the way that I interpret this, that I'm completely free just to republish it out of context. So I'm not doing that. I will put the direct download link onto the page at the end of this episode, so you can go and take a look at it. But I thought it was very interesting. Hey, hold on a second. I'm on a call. Oh, that's fine. Okay. I just want to know what building this is. What address? This is B. Huh? This is B. Sorry, I'm on a call. Okay. All right. So we're doing this live, everybody. I have neighbors. The door is open because I like the cool air and the sunlight. So I apologize for the interruption. So so this is a very, very interesting copyright license. It's different in many respects from the Creative Commons copyright license, but there's also this additional information over here that you can go take a look at, and what it is that the license is used for. And it's an interesting, not one that I had run across before, but I wanted to make sure that that I wasn't falling afoul of the copyright license as a part of today's live stream. So there's no embedding, so I'm not embedding the file in the resources, but I will put a link so that you can get to it here in this tab for the Corporate Accountability Lab. The Corporate Accountability Lab website link, I'll put it below there. So having said that, let's go take a look really, really quickly at what it is that the report says. So I downloaded the report and have read through it, and want to just go through it very, very quickly and comment on it on a bunch of different aspects. Number one, I've highlighted the link to the copyright license in case anybody's interested in being able to go at it. So the first thing that I want to do is say that people who have been regular listeners to these live streams and perhaps have read posts on the Chocolate Life will know that I am interested in language. So the language we use informs our beliefs, our beliefs inform our actions, and our actions have consequences. And therefore, we need to be careful about the kind of language that we use, because once we adopt particular words, they change, the way we think about things. And if they change the way we think about things, they might change the way we act about things. And so it's really, really important to understand language. And I want to point out this word here, which is the word extracting, right? And extracting is a word, or actually a related word, called extractive, right? Which is something that I've been thinking about and talking to other people in the industry about for a little bit, for a bit over a year now. And I think that for me, when we move to things like regenerative agriculture, as opposed to what kind of agriculture are we talking about, right? The status quo, the way agriculture is currently being done. It makes sense to try to have a single word like regenerative that talks about a lot of agricultural policy. And the word that I came up is to describe that is extractive. So the other end of the spectrum from 100% regenerative agriculture is 100% extractive agriculture. And the idea of extractive agriculture is that you're trying to just get as much value out of the land as possible for the minimum amount of investment. And that minimum amount of investment is not only in the short term, but what it also does is it fails to recognize or pushes off risks and consequences associated with those policies onto other people. So not the company itself, not necessarily the investors in the company itself, right? And onto future generations. So for me, it made sense to think about extractive agriculture as sort of the polar opposite of regenerative agriculture, right? And the parallel for that for me is Well, extractive agriculture or regenerative agriculture, can we put it into a larger system, sort of, framework philosophically, right? That we can use to draw parallels. And so for me, regenerative agriculture suggests that there is a parallel of regenerative economics. Right? And regenerative economics, if the idea of regenerative agriculture is that you take care of the land so that it remains healthy and thriving, just generically, it's a simple definition for regenerative agriculture. With regenerative economics, that's also the case, that you make sure that there's enough money in the system to be able to achieve the objectives that you have, whether those are environmental objectives, social objectives, some other kinds of objectives, so that regenerative economics is is outside the circle. It's not a Venn diagram, although you could create a Venn diagram of it, but these are regenerative agriculture fits entirely within the sphere of regenerative economics at the moment. Right. And so the opposite of that becomes extractive economics, sort of logically speaking. So extractive economics is where the goal is to get pull as much value out of the system as you can, right, without worrying about what the consequences are, and then without worrying where the money is coming from, who you're taking that money from. You're redistributing it to people, right, who may not need it. That's a different philosophical question entirely. And then that parallel begins, to make sense to me, that regenerative agriculture is part of a system of regenerative economics. And if what you want to do is you actually want to implement regenerative agriculture, you need to think about, right, the larger economic system that it is at play, right, and that may need to be changed or may need to be coerced or finagled or something, so that the people who are currently benefiting from the extractive economics, the people who are pushing off the risk of environmental damage. I'm thinking about oil exploration in the Amazon. For decades, the company said, well, we don't even have to worry about practices which will keep the rainforest free of environmental damage. Once we cause the damage, we're not responsible for it. The people who live there are responsible for it, either morally or economically responsible. We don't care, right? And that's where extractive economics is and extractive agriculture is. And so if we're going to think about regenerative agriculture, we need to think about regenerative economics. It makes sense. And then a larger sphere outside of that is we currently exist within a system, especially here in the United States, but we see it many places in the world, of what I would think of as extractive politics. That extractive politics is really can be talked about, partisan separation, and pitching one group of people against another people. And regenerative politics is all about making sure that the system holds together, so that there is agreement about the kinds of economic policies that we agree that we want to be able to support. And right now, this extractive political environment is all about making, all the power comes to me, right? It's a zero-sum game. It's not enough just for me to win. Somebody has to lose. And so I wanted to preface that, or provide that preface before going into the meat of this particular article. So we're about a third of the way in. I want to thank everybody who has been watching, who is joining. And again, mention in the comments, let me know where you're connecting from. I'll get the shout out up on the screen. So big, I think, framework to go in, and the platform to put this article on. Number one, so the comments that I'm going to make here might seem a little bit nitpicky. What I want to say is that, I am, in general, very supportive of the kinds of efforts that go into the research and production of a report like this. I think the aims and the goals of the organization that does this and other organizations doing related things are noble. I just want to be a little a skeptical eye, as somebody who has been thinking about this for quite some time, who has been communicating around these topics for quite some time. I just want to provide you with some background, so that what you can do is you can go look through this yourself, and you can go and perhaps um, um, take what it is that you learn here, and form your own opinions, not necessarily adopt someone else's opinions wholesale. So nice little table of contents, an executive summary, introduction, recommendation. So they're saying, here's an overall view of the project. Here's what we recommend as changes, rather than taking those recommendations and burying at the end. So you can very, very quickly say, okay, what's the high level overview, and what do the authors of this report recommend in order to be able to address the issues that are introduced into the high level executive summary. So they start off with just like this bang, for decades, and it's at least 5 decades, and at least into the 70s. Cocoa and chocolate companies have plundered the wealth of Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. Very, very strong, opening sentence to an opening statement for the propositions, right? These companies extract as much value as possible. And this, again, gets to my notion of extractive agriculture and extractive economics. From the approximately 3 million metric tons of cocoa beans painstakingly harvested each year by smallholder farmers across the 2 countries. I've highlighted in my copy smallholder farmers. And for me, I would have liked to know how many smallholder farmers are estimated to be involved in the production. I think it would be helpful to know at this point, are we talking about 100,000 farmers? Are we talking about 1 million farmers? And it's not just the farmers, but it's the size of their families. So, there's a difference in the average size of families between Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. I'd sort of like to know, if we're talking about 1 million farming families, are we talking 3 million people, 5 million people, 6 million people, 8 million people? Just for me. All right. I would have liked that. It says in 2022, chocolate companies brought in $206 billion in revenue. And this is where I wish they had put a footnote into here. I would like to know where they got this figure of $206 billion, because it's different from most of the reports that I get from industry. Now, this is a figure that is sometimes put together by research firms of varying quality, but I would like to know where it came from. And, this is a PDF document, and I should be able to embed active links in a PDF document. And so I don't have a link. So what I have to do, right, is I have to scroll all the way down, right? So 50 pages later, to scroll all the way down to go and keep on going, keep on going, keep on going. Right? And this makes the document really cumbersome to be able to navigate. Now there is a 1 here, right? So I see this 1 end note. I didn't see a corresponding 1 up on the page right next to that. So I'm going to go back and look at it again. But again, this is a PDF document. This is not an active link, right? So this suggests to me that the document is locked. Maybe it's password protected or something like that. I can't do it. I can't copy this text out of the document. I have to use this link here, right, which shows up on the first line. It's just really, really cumbersome. One of the reasons to produce documents in electronic form, especially PDF, is that I can have active links. And I don't have any active links here, and I am really annoyed that I don't have any active links here. So just really, really quick. All right. So after going through and saying, okay, what does that all mean, right? What I did is I actually went and looked at the report. So here's the report. World chocolate market is expected to grow at a moderate pace to $263 billion by 2030. Right, and I believe that is the way it was reported, so I don't have any problem with that. We have this is a press service, Globe Newswire, and this report is put together by a company called Indexbox. And so I'm looking through here for anything which might give me an idea about what it is that this figure talks about. So it just says the current state of the chocolate industry. We don't know what the scope of the chocolate industry is. There's some trends here. There's all sorts of interesting things. This Right. Sources. This is actually just linked to other Globe Newswire press releases. So we actually have to, for example, go to Indexbox, right? And there's no link to Indexbox. I had to go find them, and we find out it's a company that develops software and sells reports based upon its proprietary software. It's interesting. We get some fun things to do, and this really interested me, right? So what I can do is I can go and I can't actually look at any of the data, but what I can do is I can go and look at what I can do. One of the things that they don't do here, which I am really, really find a challenge, is that they don't actually provide any notion here. Maybe you need to spend a couple $100 in order to subscribe to the service in order to understand what the source is for this data. I mean, is this data from ICCO? Is this data from the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN? I don't know where the data sources are, and so I don't know what it is that they're talking about. It's just some really, really fabulous. I would, looking at some of these things, I would love to know exactly where the data comes from, and to know, again, what the sources are in order to be able to talk about it. But there's nothing here that gives me any confidence or any understanding about how this is put together, where the information that this is based upon. And I get it. I mean, these market research companies do that, but this is a place where I would have liked Corporate Accountability Lab to do a little more due diligence. And if they didn't get that data, if they couldn't publish the data, at least do a high-level summary of an understanding of, they just didn't take a number from a research report somewhere. I would have liked to have seen it. The other thing to take a look at, and this is always very interesting, is if there is a segment which is, the companies mentioned in this report, right? Go take a look at the companies. So companies mentioned in this world chocolate market are Nestle, Mars, Mondelez, the Hershey Company, Lindt & Sprüngli, Barry Callebaut, Ferrero, Cho Ventures. And this is really interesting because of all the companies that are here, Cho is not like any of the others. Valrhona, Ghirardelli. It doesn't mention the link that Ghirardelli is in fact owned by Lindt. That's a bit of information that we should probably know. It may be elsewhere in the report. I'm not sure. Godiva Chocolatier. Godiva is owned by Yildiz Holdings, a Turkish company, and See's Candies. But to suggest that somehow, these companies are on a level playing field are a challenge, especially when we go up here and they do talk about like small single origin craft chocolate makers. So single origin versus blended chocolates. They're talking about trends. The other thing that is interesting to note about this is that, as I said, they don't define what the chocolate industry is. So does the 200 and some odd billion dollars they're talking about here, $263 billion by 2030, right? And I don't know what the CAGR is to get from, 1.9% from 2022 to 2030. Okay, so, and what we get is, interesting note that 5 million metric tons of cocoa, more or less, becomes 43.5 million tons of chocolate something, right? And this is the point. Are we talking about, does this include cocoa beans or not? I mean, does this include the value of cocoa processing or not? I don't know. Is this just retail products? And if we're talking about retail products, we have chocolate confectionery, but we also have the chocolate that is used in bakery and the chocolate that is used in frozen desserts, including ice cream. And so this is also, are we thinking about cocoa butter and confectionery? And is that chocolate? And the numbers here require some explanation in order to understand how they got to that $263 billion figure. And again, it is what it is. I'm just looking through this and I'm looking askance at it saying, this isn't what other sources suggest this is going to be. And I don't know what the breakdown is. And I would really, really like to know what's going on here. Just really, really quickly understand what the report is saying. And when you get an assertion, right, and you get a link here, and you go to examine the link, what is it that you learn when you examine the link? So just an important technique when you're reading these reports. And now I have to go back all the way up to the top. Easy to overshoot. And again, I'm looking here and it said footnote number 1 or endnote number 1. There is no actual link to that. So again, I had to go through this whole back and forth in order to be able to figure out what it says. But what's interesting, again, for me, about taking a look at this, right, is the first sentence used the word plundered, right? And plundered is a very emotionally loaded word. I mean, it says not only, has, things of value been taken from one group to another group, but it also suggests that there's been some sort of violence. It could be physical violence, it could be moral violence, but it has been done. So it has been wrenched, it has been pulled away. And so plundered is a really, really good word here to start things off, right? Painstakingly is another good word in the context of this. And yet the rest of this is a fairly intellectual argument, that they've gone from this very, very, emotionally laden language straight into facts and figures. And for me, that was disconcerting is not the right word, but it changed the way my brain was thinking about what they were doing. All right. So the prices that companies pay for cocoa are so low that farmers cannot often hire adult workers and instead must rely on their children, or in some cases, trafficked children. Right. Right. This is sort of an intellectual approach to a very emotional, illegal label, child slavery. It's could I go and continue on with the language of plundering and painstaking, right, in order to be able to get the reader to agree on a narrative, right, for what it is that's going on. This is an intellectual argument. It makes sense. I believe that many of the people who are at the Corporate Accountability Lab are lawyers, and it makes sense in that context. But there's a mixture of, what is the hardship that the farmers are going to, what are the hardships the farmers are facing, and then what is it that these big companies are doing? So we do have human rights and environmental harm that characterize the West African cocoa sector, and they haven't done anything to say, right? They've asserted it, but they haven't done anything to say that structurally the two companies that I mentioned, Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, are very, very different from other places in the world. They're relying on the reader to have an understanding that there are structural differences in the way Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana work, that other countries in the world don't operate under those same rules. And then we get a quick paragraph about the methodology, which is to say we visited some farmers in 2 different countries, cooperatives, and one of the things that we learned from them is that, right, the consensus among the farmers, okay, so this is 300 farmers from, I believe, a total of 14 different cooperative organizations representing something like 10,000. That might have been just in one of the 2 countries, but that a fair price for cocoa is at least triple the current price, right? And at that point, what I want to suggest is I want to go to the very top here, and I want to go take a look and see what the first instance of farm gate price is, right? And so the first interest of farm gate price is mentioned on page 5 here, and it's a part of the executive summary. So it's right. But when people are talking about a fair price for cocoa is at least triple the current price, again, it requires some knowledge, right? Um, and very, very close reading to understand that what they're talking about here is they're talking about the farm gate price. They're not talking about the world price of cocoa. It is inferred, but it is not directly stated in here, right? They also made an interesting observation, is that farmers and workers spoke about the unsustainably low prices companies pay for companies and their failure to pay the living income differential, a government mandated price increase, right? And so even though there are government mandates to pay this living income differential, the companies are not paying it. So again, the executive summary says, right, there is a problem associated with farmer poverty, and that companies exploit these impoverished farmers for their own profit. A really, really good point to make. Again, I think that they um, missed an opportunity by not making a more emotional connection to things and focusing on sort of, I'm thinking about this in my brain rather than my heart. But the invisible stakeholders, many reports tend to talk about farmers and we assume they're men. And if we're talking about illegal labor, we may know something about child slaves, but women, children, and hired laborers are in fact stakeholders that we almost never hear about in these reports. And so focusing on the fact that, as I suggested earlier, if I talk about 1 million farmers, if I include the farmer's spouse and their children, that million farming families might be 6 million people. And we need to think about this larger context because it gives us a much, much better idea of what the scope of the problem is, rather than focusing on just the head of household, the person who's identified as running the operation. Right. So, and there are threats, and they mentioned 2 of them: tree diseases and gold mining. I think that there are more threats to cocoa farms than tree diseases and gold mining. So they mentioned one, cocoa swollen shoot disease, which CSSD, which is spreading throughout that part of the world and is in fact an issue. And how do we go about dealing with cocoa swollen shoot disease? And then they talk a lot about mining and the impact that mining operation has. I would say that not directly mentioning climate change here, right? So the fact that there has been so much deforestation that rainfall patterns have changed significantly, temperature patterns have changed significantly. Probably the more existential change, not only to the cocoa, but to the farmers and things generally, that I'm surprised it wasn't mentioned as a threat to the livelihoods of cocoa farmers. Before we jump into the recommendations and my thought about the recommendations, what I want to do is I want to say we're about halfway through today's episode. If you're watching YouTube, LinkedIn, or Facebook, go into the comments. Let me know where you're connecting from. If you got a question that you'd like to talk about, then also go put it into the comments and I'll get it up on the screen and we can talk about it. So they make some recommendations. Number one. Right, the number one recommendations is that companies must pay a living income to farmers. And okay, yeah, if I'm involved in labor, what I'd like to do is I'd like to make sure that I am compensated adequately for the value of my labor. But I would, just getting back to the United States, is $7.25 an hour a living wage, right? So how do we force the countries in which these farmers live to pay a living wage? And how do we determine what a living wage is? And should we, as people in the United States, be saying, hey, you should be paying a living wage, even though, many states in the United States obviously don't? So just a quick overview of that. And that includes if we go take a look, for example, at the work done by Robin Romano and his film La Cosecha, The Harvest, which documented some children, immigrant farm workers, probably illegal immigrants in the United States, children working on American farms. It's a challenge to get to the fact that sort of we're in any moral position to do this. Yes, it makes sense that people who work should be compensated for their work. And the compensation they get should not just be at a subsistence level or below a subsistence level. It enables them to live a dignified life and to thrive and to be able to make future plans for their children as well as for themselves. All right. So companies must immediately pay the full living income differential and the Ivorian and Ghanaian country premiums. Right. The companies must also go beyond the government mandated price floor to ensure that farmers are paid an actual living income. Right. Suggested by the farmers in 2022 to be triple the current rate, and that this full amount reaches the farmers. So, okay. So what they've said is take whatever the farm gate price is, which is legally mandated in the Ivory Coast and Ghana, and immediately triple it, and then make sure that whatever premiums there might be, the living income differential, and if there's any country premium, that also gets delivered to the farmers, right? And they suggest a minimum. So farmers must be paid $3,000 a metric ton in Cote d'Ivoire, $3,166 per metric ton in Cote d'Ivoire, and $3,116 per metric ton in Ghana, right? And let's throw in a cost of living escalation clause in that. But one of the things that this says, all right, in here, is that right now, when we think about the cost of cocoa, we think about the price of cocoa. Most of us think about what the price of cocoa is on the exchange. So what's the New York price? What's the London price? And we think about it usually in terms of US dollars, right? And so these numbers represent, so the point here is that the farmers must be paid. And so what this suggests, and I'm surprised that it's not a recommendation here, right, is that there needs to be a wholesale shift among all the players in the industry to focus on what the farm gate price is, right? And not just the farm gate price in Ivory Coast and Ghana, because endemic poverty on farms around the world, and not just cocoa farms. I mean, we should take this idea for coffee and other things as well. This becomes a very, very specific ask, but I think it needs to become a more generalized ask, because again, if we're talking about agricultural workers, there's an economic system and a political system that they live, that they exist within. And this is really, really interesting when we start thinking about it. So what I want to do is I want to go, is the International Cocoa Organization, by abbreviation ICCO, mentioned in the document? They're not, right? So outside like the Government Cocoa Board of Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, ICCO, probably the single most influential political organization in the world when it comes to cocoa pricing and policy and things like that. And so the fact that there does not appear to be any mention of ICCO here is interesting to me. There's also an organization based in London called the Federation of Cocoa Commerce. FCC rules dominate the contract terms under which cocoa is exported out of West Africa, and it does not appear that the Federation of Cocoa Commerce, at least by its acronym, is here. Interesting to me. I would have to go read the entire thing word by word in order to be able to make sure that it took care of it. Other things, are they talking about mass balance? No, there doesn't appear to be any mention of mass balance. And what that means, again, an interesting concept that appears to be missing from what's from this. So, this is the way I read through these reports, and I thought it might be interesting for you to get an idea about what to go do about that. So from this point, right, number one, companies must pay a living wage. And so this is where Mark from Blue Spruce Chocolates is responding in his post, right? He says, at a minimum, farmers must be paid these two different prices. These prices are aligned with the most recent calculations of a living income in each country and come close to triple the rate farmers reported receiving in 2022, right? And Mark says, take a moment, let this sink that in. If that's true, what we pay now is blatantly exploitive, right? If you're not making sure that the farmers are actually receiving this amount of money. And keep in mind that whatever the living income means, um, that there are a whole lot of assumptions associated with it. So we're talking about, okay, you've got, what is the internal economy of Ghana and what is its cost base as opposed to Ivory Coast? And you might say here are, what does a kilo of rice cost here? What is a kilo of rice case here? You take a look at 100 different items and you could say, oh, this place is more expensive than that place. For example, that might be one way to do that. And then we're going just cost of living associated with that, right? There's the cost of living adjustment. And there are lots of other things that go into what it means by living wage. But the other one is we need to think about is what is the average size of a cocoa farm? And then what is the average productivity of that farm? And so if we're talking about, 2 hectares and we're talking about 2 hectares and there's a productivity of 500 kilos per hectare, just to make the math easy, that's a ton, right? So, right, 500 kilos, 2 hectares, that's a metric ton a year. That metric ton at $3,000 per metric ton says that income is going to be $3,000 a year. We divide that by 365 and it's still under $1 a day, right? On average. And that's not just per person, that's for an entire, 2, 4, 5, 6-person family. And so, okay, but again, contextualizing this, we don't know the average size of the farm here. We don't know the average productivity of the farm. We don't know what this means in terms of actual income. So Mark, I'm hoping that answers your question, is that even at these numbers, right, 3,000 a metric ton, they, without understanding the context, is like, what does this mean in terms of money in the farmer's pocket? It's a real challenge, right? And so when we look at $3,000 a metric ton right now, let's just say, which is the New York price, it might be a delivered price, right? It might not be at the port of export. So that includes all of the expenses to get it to the port, put it on a container, ship it across the world. We now need to go take a look at a place like Ghana, where the cocoa bod sets a price for cocoa that is discounted from a price which is related to what the market price is. And so, farmers are at the most getting a third of these numbers, right? And so, yeah, I mean, even as high as these numbers seem, right, they don't actually, I don't think, if we say the average farm size is 2 hectares and the average farming family, the average farm is producing 1 metric ton dry per year, you get an idea about just how insufficient even these numbers are. Again, and I wouldn't want some people outside my country telling me what the living wage was, what that made sense. I mean, maybe another way to think about this would be to say you have a 2 hectare farm, your productivity is, let's say, 500 kilos a hectare, and so we're going to give you a minimum basic income. And that minimum basic income is going to be based upon, the export price, and maybe there are other ways to do this than to think about living income differential, because I think that living income differential as a concept is an example of economic imperialism. But let's stop there just to think. So companies must establish long-term contracts at fixed prices with cocoa farmers. Right? So farmers bear the burden of market volatility. Farmers generally assume all market risk. No, they assume the fundamental basic market risk. If the price goes up, they don't get any value because all that price is upstream of them. If the price goes down, there is a minimum that gets paid contractually in 2 countries, but basically, I think the better way to think about it is farmers don't get to participate in volatile swings upwards in terms of value, right? Because they've already been paid for their labor, and if there's any increase in value, it doesn't inure to them. So this generates economic precarity, right? So precariousness, right, and indebtedness, which both contribute to creating conditions which incubate forced labor, long-term contracts, distribute links to supply chain actors who are better situated to absorb it, resulting in greater stability across the supply chain. I don't disagree with this. I think it's a very, very interesting concept, the idea of long-term contracts, but I disagree entirely on fixed price contracts, right? So that the contracts, number one, need to have an automatic escalating cost of living adjustment that is based upon the rate of inflation in that country, and not an average rate of inflation around the world or the rate of inflation. Right now, the US is at like 3.6%. Most of Europe is like, or at least the UK, at least, not part of the EU. UK is like double that. And these are low compared with other parts of the world. And so fixed price contracts make no sense, right? Without putting a cost of living adjustment in there. And other factors, which I think are really important. It's also really interesting is that Ingman, and this is a project that I have direct knowledge of it, Ingman in Nicaragua, entered into long-term contracts with some of their farmers, or with all of their farmers. And in return, what they do is they would provide them with seedlings at no cost up front. They'd provide farmer field training. They'd provide business training. How do I be a better cocoa farmer? How do I make my cocoa farming business and my family business on my land a more profitable business? Changing the way people are thinking about it. And yet there were people who said those long-term contracts were fundamentally exploitive, that the nature of a long-term contract means that the person who is buying the cocoa holds an unfair advantage over the people who are selling the cocoa. So long-term contracts, I think, can work in the particular situation of Ingemann when you step back, get some little distance, and you understand the entire impact of what they're doing. It made sense, but most of the cocoa farmers here are not going to be very sophisticated from a business perspective. And if you're going to do long-term contracts, you need to make sure that there's someone who's representing the farmers and their families, who's got their interests, and who are not going to be bullied into accepting terms that compromise the integrity of the agreement. So I think it's a good idea. I don't know how to do it. And I believe, again, that many members of the Corporate Accountability Lab are lawyers, and I'd like to get an idea of how they would make sure that these contracts are in fact enforceable in the long term. What the mechanisms are, because again, there is this agricultural system that fits within this economic system, but fundamentally it also exists within a political system, and there's a legal structure around the political system, and we need to make sure that these things, number one, are enforceable, and number two, that they are enforced. Otherwise, it's like, oh yeah, Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana says you must pay a living income differential, and yet companies do not. Like, if you don't have a policy and it's not enforced, what's the point? So really important. Could be a good idea, but the devil is in the details as always. Number three, companies must provide full and public transparency and traceability down to the farm level in every country from which they source. And they should do this for sugar. They should do this for nuts. This should not be just something which is done with cocoa. The other thing, which I think is, again, a really good idea, I don't know how they do this, right? In terms of the fundamental mechanism for how they go about doing it. And this is where we might take something like the new EU deforestation regulations, which is something I plan to cover very shortly in a live stream. We have a mishmash of how does these affect cadmium regulations? We have the deforesting regulations. We have this kind of sourcing and that kind of sourcing regulations. Differences in ESG, so environmental and social governance regulations in different countries, and we have this hodgepodge of different regimes, and who knows how they're going to go interact with each other. And so, interesting idea. Companies must provide full and public transparency. How is this going to be done, right? And how is it going to be monitored? I don't necessarily know that it needs to be certified, but there needs to be some organization that is taking a look at these things and going, this makes sense, right? And number one, who pays for that? It should be the companies. It should be the markets. No aspect of this should be go down to the farmer level. Just, again, if you got organic certification, this is something that we want to do, not something the farmers do. Making the farmers pay for the certification, I think, is fundamentally wrong, right? So there's a lot of stuff going here. This is especially important to ensure that companies are not buying cocoa produced in deforested regions of Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. So this is a direct nod to EUTR regulations, but how do these other aspects of supply chain of custody, how do you put all these other things? So supply chain of custody is somebody came to the farm gate, right, and paid X amount of price for it, and then it went through. In this case, they talk about a pistor, which is in Ecuador would be a coyote, a middleman, and that coyote may sell it to another middleman, who may sell it to another middleman, who sells it to a company representative who's exporting. The farmer may pay to a cooperative. I mean, these are very, very complicated sets of relationships to model. And unfortunately, none of the existing ERP systems. So if we look at the big ERP systems, their underlying databases are not set up to do this. This is not a place for blockchain. Blockchain is about ensuring the integrity of the data that is entered into the system. It says nothing about the veracity of the data that are entered. And so we need to be very, very careful. Interesting idea. These three things, right, are very, very interesting ideas. Again, devil's in the details. I mean, if we can get consensus around this, not just at the industry level, but at the government level, as well as at the consumer level, because in the end, consumers are paying for all of this, right? Whether they pay for it directly by buying it, whether they pay for it in their taxes, whether they pay for it in terms of donations to nonprofit organizations that then distribute these funds around the world. In the end, consumers are paying for it. And if there's not a consumer demand for these things, then we can regulate it, right? But then everybody's caught between a rock and a hard place in terms of the implementation of it. So I just wanted to, I'm here, just into, haven't even finished the executive summary, right? And we're at the end of an hour. What I want to also do at this particular point is I wanted to go, okay, there are a bunch of other studies that I'm aware of. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to look at it a little more carefully. I'm going to go find out who their sources are, made much more difficult by the fact that I can't actually click on a link on the page. I have to, and it will automatically take me to the page, which is annoying beyond belief. So please, if anybody from Corporate Accountability Lab is watching, number one, make your footnote links, endnote links active. If there's an endnote, be able to jump right to the endnote in the document where it's referenced, and then make it easy by clicking on a link to return. Right, just spend a little while making your document more usable. And if there is a link to an external source, actually make it a link that I can click on, and it will automatically open it, or at least allow me to copy the link, right, rather than using this weird link structure that's involved in the page. Just really, really quickly. So what I want to do is say, so I wanted to know. I'm putting a link to this. It's a study called Demystifying the Cocoa Sector in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. If you are interested in that report, you can go to the page for the stream, for today's stream, and there is a link right here, Demystifying the cocoa sector in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, or in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. For me, this remains a gold standard for reporting. I would like to know from Corporate Accountability Lab if they took anything from this before they began their study. And I think that one of the things that this study did that I wish other studies would also emulate is that they posted all their data. And so you can actually go in and perform analysis on the data that the researchers uncovered as a part of what they're doing. So if you want to get at the data and perform different analyses than the one they presented in the report, you can get at that data and you can take a look at it. So I think but the only part of the KIT study that's mentioned in this, right, and it focuses on Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, so it's the same two countries. It was done a couple of years ago, and it'd be interesting to know if this research found baseline differences between those two. I don't know, but the only place where they're talking about it is in terms of well, I don't know that's the only place, but they're talking about gender equity, right? So they're not talking about household structure, they're not talking about multiple income sources, but it's primarily around gender equity. And I think that the demystifying study has a whole lot more to offer to this. And so I would recommend that anybody who's interested in really doing a deep dive on this particular study for Corporate Accountability Lab, go and take a look at the results of the demystifying study from the Royal Tropical Institute, KIT, in the Netherlands. Now, one of the downsides of the KIT study is that it's done once, and it's like, I think 2018 is when it was done. That makes sense. And there hasn't been a follow-up study. And so it represents a snapshot in time. I think historically what we'd like to do is we'd like to go from, every couple of years, go and redo the study to see what sort of systemic changes there have been, if any. So are they positive or negative? How, as a result of the recommendations that they're making, what do we see in terms of changes that are going on? But, they haven't, there's just this one reference to demystifying it, on one page. You can see, if I were to move this over, you can see there's only one page reference in terms of the search. So that's a little disappointing to me. The other one is that there's a set of studies from the International Institute for Sustainable Development, the IISD, and it's not clear that there was any attempt to look at those studies. I need to go look and see a little bit more closely. I had this for 24 hours, and maybe I'll do a deeper dive later. But what you want to do is you want to go and look at those studies. I have put together just the chapters on cocoa from the 2014 study and the 2019 study. And you can go and take a look at them and get the numbers from them and see some of the other editorial that they talked about. And what I also did is this is a link to the search site page for the IISD. It's actually a link to the cocoa search page. So if you click on it, what it'll do is it'll give you the search results for cocoa. But what you can also do is you can go look at the 2014 market report, and it does coffee and bananas and a bunch of other agricultural commodities. And it's really quite interesting, especially when you go to the conclusions, which are shown. So if I go to here, what you can see is here's the global cocoa market report for cocoa. This is for 2014. And you'll learn a lot of interesting things, like at that time, only about 40% of cocoa that was certified actually earned the certification premium, right? And so we'd like to know from 2014 to 2019, right, whether that was the case. I mean, this is another data point which you can go look at, and you can compare with what it is the Corporate Accountability Lab is doing, what the Voice Network is doing, what ICO, and other sources. And I think this is really, really important because part of the challenge that we face, and this is something that I'm sure that the people at Corporate Accountability Lab found, is that without good data, you can't make good policy, right? And if you don't have good data, you're making policy decisions without understanding what the true situation is. And if you don't have historical data, you can't understand how previous policy decisions might have had a negative impact on what's going on. So I recommend that. That's the 2014 study. Here's the 2019 study from the IISD and their report. It's part of the Sustainable Commodities Marketplace series. You can go and you can get the overall marketplace report, including the conclusion. And I have not uploaded this, but I am going to upload this on the Chocolate Life. So one of the things that the conclusion, and this is in 2014, said that voluntary sustainability standards are perhaps the quintessential example of the green economy in action, which I completely disagree, right? The fact that they're voluntary, right, and the fact that oversight is distributed, and the fact that definitions and measurements are not normalized. So one quote unquote voluntary sustainability standard might be measuring one thing, Rainforest Alliance, right? And one quote unquote voluntary sustainability standard, fair trade, measures other things, right? That may be a good example of the green economy in action, but in the end, because they're voluntary and because they measure different things, and because to some extent they also require that the people who are being standardized, the farmers, in the case of cocoa, are paying for the privilege of being certified, I think fundamentally back on the entire idea. So that's what I take away from this. I mean, I don't believe the fundamental premise on the first paragraph, the first sentence of the first paragraph of the conclusion of this. Number two, but they talk about this. Oh, diversity of governance regimes. Yeah, right? Because there is a diversity of governance regimes, there are seams, right, between the regimes that people are incentivized to exploit. Gaming the system is the nature of the game, right? And people will come and they will just, because I have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize return to my shareholders, I need to go figure out a way to maximize return to shareholders in the context of these multiple, sometimes conflicting governance regulatory regimes. So there. Yeah, I mentioned it. Inconsistency of conformity assessment systems, right? If two things are measuring the same thing in different ways, it's a problem. It's just a fundamental problem, right? The absence of trade and consumption data, right? I mentioned it, right? Is like, if we don't have good data, we cannot make good policy decisions. And the fact is, in the world of cocoa, you can cherry pick whose data you're looking at in order to be able to buttress the opinion, the observations that you're trying to make. So that's really important. And I think, this is another thing, absence of impact data, right? So this is a place where I think that, Fair Trade International, I'm just picking them off the top of my head. For example, there's a lot of requirement to report up the supply chain. So from the farm up through the companies, individual companies that the cocoa changes hands through until it gets to the factory, for example. We decide we leave it there, right? But there's no reporting mechanism about money down the supply chain. If the farmer is due a premium, does the farmer actually get the premium? Or if the cooperative receives the premium, what are the specific distribution policies of the cooperative? So if the cooperative is getting $250 a ton or $500 a ton for fair trade organic certified, they're getting a premium. How much of that $500 a metric ton did the farmer get, right? On average, right? Or specifically, for each member of the cooperative, demonstrate the impact data. How are these people's lives being impacted, right? Both positively and negatively, right? And this is where we get into the whole world of greenwashing and woke washing that I've been talking about on and off for the last couple of months here on the Chocolate Life Live. These are really, really interesting challenges that go back to, we can say the government must do this, the government must do that, but lacking a formal understanding of how to implement these changes in an enforceable way is a real challenge. Now, I don't have all the answers. Obviously, I don't have all the answers. Number one, I'm not a Ghanaian cocoa farmer. I'm not an Ivorian cocoa farmer. I am not going to suggest that, some 65 plus white guy who is in Arizona, right, can presume to tell them what is fair and what a living in wage is, and any of those kinds of things. There needs to be a level of engagement there that I would love to participate in and throw my 2 cents in. but not necessarily one that I can have answers that need to be, that I can declare this must happen, and this must happen, and this must happen, right? Because there are a lot of people involved. These things are really, really complicated. And I just want to let you know, this is a closing thing. I've mentioned this this organization that I've started doing some work with called International Cocoa Diplomacy. They have a meeting later this month, the 24th, 25th, 26th of this month in London, and I'm going to be there. And I'm going to be working with the other members, the other people who are there at the International Cocoa and Chocolate Forum, which is being organized by International Cocoa Diplomacy, to be working on, among other things, sort of workshop leader on sort of things like governance structure and what the mission is going to be and how we're going to engage, not just with governments and NGOs and cocoa and chocolate companies, but how we're actively going to empower cocoa farmers to start with, maybe other commodities later on, but this is international cocoa diplomacy, how we're going to work to get cocoa farmers as well as consumers, right? The kinds of tools that they need to educate themselves to the level that they're interested in being educated, and then to be able to become, in essence, better diplomats for the kinds of changes. So how can they be more active, more effective in helping bring about the kinds of changes that they want to see in the system? So no small challenges, but this is something that I confirmed about 24 hours ago, that I'm going to be in London at the end of the month for this particular meeting. And I am really, really looking forward to being there and having an opportunity to discuss what I think are these fundamental issues. And for me, part of what it is that I was doing today, reading this Corporate Accountability Lab report, and I will continue to do over the course of a month and continue to read that report, again, in combination with refamiliarizing myself with a demystifying study, demystifying the cocoa sector in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire from the Royal Tropical Institute, refamiliarizing myself with that, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, their reports, and a bunch of other reports, to be able to go in and arm myself for the kinds of conversations that I'm going to be having in the next, at the end of the month. And so with that, we're a few minutes over, but we've done really well today. We've covered a lot of stuff. What I want to do before I go is also point out to everyone that, I have some nits to pick regarding the, let me get this. I have some nits to pick with the Corporate Accountability Lab study, which is called There Will Be No More Cocoa Here. And I didn't get through all of it by any stretch of the imagination. And so the kinds of things that I'm pointing out are the kinds of things that jump out at me that I would like to see in order to more fully, number one, put the arguments on a firmer foundation. So what is your source? Knowing that the source was vetted, and you had an understanding about what the primary sources were rather than the secondary sources were. Things like that I think are really, really important that they do. So the comments that I have are ones which I hope will be taken for the most part as constructive criticism, right? And the other thing is, I talked about, okay, there are these recommendations. The industry must do this and must do that and must do that, and the governments must do this and must do that. And this is to start a conversation, right? This is to start a conversation about those things. And just so if people are interested in continuing that conversation, that one of the places they can do that is on The Chocolate Life. So again, I want to remind everybody as we close that The Chocolate Life Live is by the members of The Chocolate Life. If you're not a member, go. You may see a green account button here. That's because I'm logged in to my account. You can go there. It'll say join. You can join. Always a free membership, right? If you're watching on YouTube, please hit the like button. subscribe to the channel, and support the work that we do here. So you can go and keep on top of things. Because if you are a member, you get a monthly newsletter. If you're a premium member, every time there's a new live post, you'll get an update on what it is that goes on. And as I do, you can go here and you don't have to follow and get the links while you're watching. You don't need to look at URLs or read very closely. I put the links to the websites that I visit on the page. Right? And so you can go and refer to those at your leisure at any time in the future. And then we can also continue the conversation here on the page on The Chocolate Life. You have to be a member, free member, premium member, doesn't matter. You do have to be a member to respond and comment here on the page. And I read all of these and respond to them. Number one, to let you know that I'm paying attention. But number two is to, again, keep the conversation going. And I think that that's really, really important. And with that, I want to say thank you, everybody who's watched me from the beginning to the end, and to welcome you to future episodes of The Chocolate Life Live, and to say, as I always do, as I end each episode, remember, if you're working with chocolate and you're not having fun, and even though we're talking about really, really serious stuff here, it's important to know that chocolate is one of the things that can bring great joy to people's lives. And we want to make sure that the supply of the ingredients that bring this joy into our lives are ones that continue, and that we're doing so in a way that is not exploitive of the people who are doing most of the hard work, right, in bringing this to us. And with that, ciao, everyone. Until the next time.